Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and thank you so very much for joining me this evening and sending you love, each and every one of you. So before we get started, if you haven't subscribed to our channel, please do so. Click the notification for that bell and of course the thumbs up. So let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Leonarda, but many people often call me Lenny for short. And I'm from an Italian heritage on my dad's side of the family, hence my Italian name. I have lived in Washington State all my life, and I literally love it here, as it is indeed an idyllic part of the world to live, with year-round rather good weather and lots of indoor and outside activities, as well as ravishing views of silvery lakes, dreamy forests, very attractive-looking homes, and colourful yards. I grew up here in an enchanting Italian-style symmetrical home, with a great deal of Italianite influences, including a grey slate roof, large French windows and whitewashed walls, with stylised arches, pretty water fountains and a couple of Michelangelo-style statues. The front and back yards were covered in carpets of lush green grass and a scattering of pretty trees, not to mention colourful seasonal flowers in bloom, both in summer and spring. We also possessed a very large, sumptuous entertainment area in the backyard, that overlooked a state-of-the-art, rather stunning-looking swimming pool. There was also a massive pizza oven for cooking melt-in-the-mouth Italian lamb flanks, and the best pizza that you've ever tasted in your life, made from a secret Italian recipe from my great-grandmother. Growing up, I was an only child, although I did have a half-sister from my dad's side of the family, who was actually a nun and was now working in Uganda. My mother was my widowed father's second wife, and she was easily 20 years his junior. When I was about 13 years old, my dad tragically passed away very suddenly from a heart attack, and it was a very tumultuous, challenging time for my mother and I, as we had to adapt to life without the winsome personality and bewitching Italian charm of my father. Needless to say, I was fortunate enough to have a very privileged and blessed childhood, because my extraordinary mother pushed out all the stops to ensure that life was indeed very good for me. She literally went out on a limb to secure a well-paid job for herself as a legal secretary to offer us both the good standard of living from which we'd both grown accustomed. Even though she'd never worked for a day in her life before, she took the bit in her mouth, dived into the deep end like a champion, and never ever looked back. My story really begins when I was about 21 years old, in the January of 1996. I seem to recall that it was on a Saturday night that the snow began to fall, and in the neighbourhood where I lived, it was easily from 4 to 6 inches deep, if I remember well. It was late that night that I was going to be driving in these hazardous speculative conditions to my cousin's 21st birthday party, which was about 40 minutes away from where I lived. Many of my young friends had been invited. I was also considered a very careful, assertive and fastidious driver, and so I generously offered to give all 3 of my friends a lift, in less than favourable, rather treacherous conditions, to the very party in question. My mother had an ominous, foreboding feeling deep down in her gut about me driving in this tumultuous, unpredictable weather, but I put it all down to her being overly neurotic and influenced by too many alarming weather reports, warning people not to drive unless, of course, it was imperative or extremely pressing. Personally, I thought my cousin's 21st was indeed a mandatory occasion that could not be avoided, as you do indeed only turn 21 once in a lifetime. As a young man, I was not going to allow a little snowfall to ruin the lavish, wonderful party that my cousin had prepared, of which no expense had been prepared. It would seem that most of the youngsters were still going to attend the sleepover party, despite the somewhat dicey bad weather reports. On the contrary, we were going to make the most of the snowy conditions. So there we were, driving through the exquisitely beautiful winter wonderland of Washington State, where now carpets of thick snow covered the trees like dusty white icing sugar, and the white snow had enveloped the whole area in glorious blanketed fields of white, which was so dramatic, imposing, but incredibly magical, all at the same time. It was about 6 p.m. at night, and thankfully there weren't many cars out on the road because of the perilous, precarious conditions out there. and we began to drive amidst the animated laughter, happy chatting, and the music that was blaring from the radio. I was suddenly hit with this feeling of impending dread, and it was like a dark, menacing, ominous thundercloud in my gut, which was saying to me in a tiny little mouse-like voice, "Please don't go. Please don't go." I remember the anxiety seemed to heighten as I drove, because despite my excellent tyres, my grip on the road was not as smooth and plain sailing as I'd previously anticipated. I kept telling myself to stop being so gutless, as of course nothing bad was going to happen. Before long, everybody was talking excitedly about the party, as we would be staying at my cousin's house for a couple of days, and he had so many thrilling adventures planned up his sleeve. Also, the girl that I fancied like mad was already at his house, along with few of her very attractive girlfriends. On previous occasions I'd been too reticent and reserved to make her acquaintance, due to my crippling shyness and a desperate fear of rejection. Now I was more determined than ever that I was going to unleash my irresistible Italian charm upon her, that I was certain she would find impossible to resist. As I drove forwards, my thoughts were focusing on the very best chat-up lines to use on her, and I decided a touch of humour was definitely necessary. After all, girls liked it when you made them laugh. I pondered in my mind on the humorous chat-up lines I should use, like, "Are you from Tennessee? Because you're the only 10 I see." No, that sounded rather lame and a bit wishy-washy. How about, "I must be a snowflake, because I've fallen for you"? No, that didn't sound good either. "Do you like raisins? How do you feel about a date?" As I was reflecting upon all of this, my two friends in the back, Marco and Eddie, were singing to the radio music, which possessed a pleasing rhythmic beat, while Paul, who was in the seat next to me, appeared to be rummaging through my cubbyhole, looking for some bottled sweets. "Is this all you've got?" he complained. "I've never liked cherry flavour. Don't you have any pear drops? They're the best." I noticed we appeared to be driving through an unfamiliar, vast wooded area that seemed more off the beaten track than I'd previously realised. I wondered if I'd taken a wrong turning, or worse still, if I'd somehow lost my way. Should I have taken the right turning earlier on, I thought. On either side of the road were towering evergreen trees that literally stretched back for miles. Luckily, there'd only been a scattering of cars on the road, and I was glad to observe we were making steady progress and pretty good time. That was, of course, if I wasn't completely lost. For that moment I was not going to give that horrifying thought any consideration. "Where are we?" asked Marco. "I don't recognise this area at all. You do know where we're going, do you?" Of course I lied. "I know the way very well." I said this with a growing sense of unease, as I began to feel almost certain that I was definitely lost, but this was something that I wasn't prepared to share with my passengers at this present moment in time. Maybe I could surreptitiously turn around at the next turning. The deteriorating stormy weather conditions worsened every passing minute as the tempestuous, fierce-pounding winds rattled fiercely against my car windows. Occasionally they blustered against my car so boisterously that it actually caused it to wobble. It was so dangerous, to the extent that I was almost afraid that the wind would actually lift my car off the road. That's how bad it was. As we drove up this hilly incline, my driving got even more problematic and troublesome, as my car started slipping hazardously all over the place, and even my passengers were becoming heated, petulant, and very upset. "Man, this is freaking me out," came Marco's crabby voice that sounded heightened by anxiety. "Drive straight, man," he said. "You're sliding all over the place. You're doing my nut in. You can't play Russian roulette with our lives like this." "Look, I'm trying really hard," I said. "It's not easy, you know, to keep the car straight on the road. It seems like the road is slipping all over the place and my car's sliding everywhere. It seems as if my tyres are not gripping the road as they should." "Just be careful," came Paul's reassuring voice. "I'm sure we'll be fine. Just drive very carefully." Those were his famous last words, because as I drove along the narrow road, I suddenly observed the figure of a woman in white, standing there in the middle of the road, and she was staring straight at me with an airy look that sent shivers of dread down my spine. What the heck? I thought, trying to manoeuvre the car out of the way, because I'd have run straight over this woman if I hadn't. In a trice, my car tyres just lost their grip and went slipping, sliding and skidding to the edge of the rocky embankment, where my car just lifted off the road, literally like a bird in flight, and somersaulted over the guardrail, where it was flung violently backwards towards the valley below. It was situated on the edge of a heavy wooded area, and it rolled like an athlete doing a backwards flip, and crashed on the ground with an ear-piercing, thunderous thud. They say that your life flashes before you in those final moments of your life in a car wreck, and they're absolutely right about that. In that instant, I was more than certain that I was going to die, and I remember accepting my fate. Yet, even though everything happened so incredibly fast and quickly, it was as if time stood very still, almost as if someone had put the remote control on pause, as it would seem that every dreadful passing second lasted a lifetime. I wanted this all to be over as fast as possible. Finally, when the car did crash to the ground, everything became very noiseless and suddenly very quiet. I remember breathing a sigh of relief. I noticed everything in the car became deathly silent, and then it seemed I blanked out, and it was like I slipped into unconsciousness. I remember waking up to hear someone shaking the car very hard, causing it to rattle and wobble precariously. I could hear these strange chattering sounds that appeared to sound like a kind of monkey language, as if two people were engaged in a rather earnest conversation of some kind. It was all exceedingly bizarre and very peculiar. But I want to assure you, when you're slipping in and out of consciousness, you become strangely accepting of strange phenomena, much in the same way as you would in a dreamlike state. Suddenly I saw this large cone-shaped head with an angular face peering through the window at me. I opened my eyes ever so slightly to see these concerned-looking golden eyes staring intently at me. I then heard what I can only describe as an excited whoop and then a chatter as the creature began to realise that I was indeed alive. It seemed to be tugging violently at the mangled metal of my car, which he bent backwards with one of his overlong arms. Even though I was delirious, everything became incredibly surreal to me. But I do remember those overlong, powerful, strong, hairy arms pulling me out of my vehicle and laying me on the ground much further afield. I could hear banging, crashing, rattling sounds, as well as the continued chattering. It was not long before 3 more bodies were laid down beside me on the grass. It appeared that whatever these creatures were, they had rescued all of us. It was with relief that I could hear Paul and Marco let out a few uncomfortable groans. But Eddie remained deathly silent, and that scared the hell out of me. I remember looking up at the creatures that were staring down at us with rather perturbed, very earnest looks on their deep concerned faces. I noticed that these critters were colossal in size, like humanoid mountain giants, with ape-like influences, and they were covered in very dark flowing hair. I remember thinking that I'd never ever seen creatures like this before, and I wondered what in God's name they actually were. As I opened my eyes, one of the big hairy humanoids nudged me with his broad hand and began chattering away to me in a language I couldn't understand. He began to look into my eyes with such a loving warmth, as if to say everything will be all right, and I felt that in my gut, as if he'd actually spoken to me, as strange as that sounds. After that I remember nothing at all, as I drifted into unconsciousness and woke up in astonishment to find myself in a hospital bed, with only a few scars to account for my accident, along with a violently throbbing head, as I had naturally sustained a little concussion. It would seem that Eddie had been tragically killed in the accident, and that Marco was permanently crippled for life, but the 2 of us that had been seated in the front of the car had actually escaped with our lives intact, and we were no worse for wear, apart from the inevitable bruises, scrapes, cuts, and a little concussion, obviously. As you can imagine, I blame myself for the car wreck, and Marco's parents naturally accused me of negligent driving and causing their son's crippled condition. I couldn't blame them for feeling this way because I felt wholly responsible for everything. This whole horrifying fiasco ultimately caused my mother to have a serious nervous breakdown, where she ultimately needed shock treatment because she blamed herself for letting me venture out in those crazy wintry conditions. Eddie's parents were much more forgiving towards me, even though they had tragically lost their son, and they told me not to blame myself for what had transpired that fateful night. I was the one that was tougher on myself than anybody else could have been, and my own worst judge, as I was unable to forgive myself for what had happened to two of my very best friends. For a long time, my memories of the woman in white on the road and the strange creatures that had pulled us out of the car seemed rather like a hazy blur, and I believed I'd imagined it all. "You mustn't blame yourself for what happened," said Paul. "If that strange woman in white hadn't been in the middle of the road, we would have all been fine. You had to avoid running her over and you had to swerve, and that's why the car flipped over the embankment, because it was precariously slippery on that road. Don't you remember?" "You saw her too," I said, looking at him with a shocked expression on my face. "I saw her," said Paul, "but I did wonder if she was actually real." "What do you mean real?" I asked. "Well, don't you think there was something ethereal and rather spooky about her?" he asked me. "You think she was a ghost?" I asked my friend in horror. "Well, it's a distinct possibility," he said, "but you can't ever be sure about that. Yet if she wasn't, why was she standing in the middle of the road in a flimsy cotton white dress in the middle of winter?" "Good point," I said. "I'd never thought about that before." Paul looked at me with an awkward expression on his face, as if he wanted to say something, but was rather reluctant to do so. "Did you see them?" he asked me. "See what?" I asked. The hairy creatures that pulled us out of the car after we crashed. They looked like giant apes with hair. Do you remember them?" "You saw them too?" I asked. "I thought it must have been a dream." "No, it was real," said Paul. "They were real." He then told me that our bodies would not have been discovered so quickly if a piece of very heavy metal from the car accident hadn't been placed in the middle of the road. I think those creatures put it in the road to draw attention to the accident so the police would search for the rest of the vehicle, which meant they would have found our car at the bottom of the embankment, which would have easily been overlooked, and we could have spent the rest of the night out in those freezing conditions. Something or someone had literally covered our bodies in branches to keep out the freezing weather. I gather one of the officers didn't understand why a large piece of our crashed car was actually lying in the middle of the road, and why all four of us were lying next to each other outside the accident scene, covered in branches. It was only years later that I was to discover that the creatures that had rescued us that night were in fact Bigfoots, but my story doesn't end there, as you might expect. 30 years later, when I was married and my wife was already at work, and I was sleeping in later that morning, as I had been working night shift, I woke to find a man standing at the end of my bed with a balaclava over his head and a revolver in his hand that he was wobbling precariously and very dangerously. Naturally, I thought I was in a dream, because you never ever imagine somebody holding a rifle to your head. It happens in the movies, but not really in real life. "I'm going to kill you," he said. "You deserve to die." I noticed that the voice sounded very tearful and distressed, and I should have been utterly terrified, having a revolver in my face, but the person behind the balaclava sounded much like my son. "What's going on?" I asked. "Who are you?" To my astonishment, the young man pulled off his balaclava, and I was staring at a 13-year-old boy who looked very distressed and anguished, and his blue eyes were filling with tears. "I'm Marco's son, the one you crippled for life in that accident. Do you remember?" I looked at the young man, and my eyes flooded with tears. This was the first time I'd physically really cried over that accident. But seeing this young boy like this brought on the emotions, and they rose up and just poured out of my eyes. "Oh, I'm so sorry," I said. "How is your father these days?" Like you care, said the boy. My dad is dead, thanks to you. The doctors concluded it's all connected to his crippling condition, which is why he died, and it's all your fault, because you caused the crippling in the first place. I don't know what to say, I said to the young man. I'm so sorry. There's not a day that doesn't go by that I don't really regret what happened. The young boy dropped the gun to the ground, which I found out later had never been loaded. He began to weep, and I took him into my arms, and we both cried together for a very long time, and the tears really did help bring about healing for both of us. How old are you? I asked him. 13, he said. I lost my father at your age. I know exactly what you're going through. Shortly after that experience, I made amends with Marco's family, and now his wife and son visit us regularly for social engagements, and it seems that these interactions have been very healing for all of us. I always regret the day I did not listen to my gut instinct or the warning voice of my mother telling me not to go. Nowadays, if the conditions are bad out there, I prefer never to take the risk of driving in treacherous snowy conditions, because no matter how safely you drive, things can quickly get out of control. So there you are. That's my story. I just want to thank you so much for that astonishing, extraordinary and mind-blowing story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.